For this week's assignment on mobile and handheld devices, I chose to incorporate mobile devices in multiple pieces of a lesson for my sixth grade math class. One of the biggest components we teach in sixth grade math is ratio, proportion, and percent. I have been in the habit in the past of having my students only compute finding percent on paper. I think that it's important that they learn those computation skills. However, I do find that sometimes my struggling learners have a really difficult time with those computation, more specifically their division and their multiplication. And I also find that assignments that have an extensive amount of computation can take a really long time and can almost take away from the big picture, the big idea. So I chose to focus on percent lessons that I teach in my sixth grade class. So this lesson was on finding percent of a number, specifically when students are finding a discount, tax, or a tip when they're at a restaurant or a store. So I decided to start off the lesson by doing a scavenger hunt. Students will use their mobile devices to scan a QR code on the on the scavenger hunt pieces that are hanging around the classroom. So on the screen, you'll see an example of what those QR codes will look like. So the only thing that students will see is this small piece of paper that has the QR code and then a clue. So once a student begins the activity, they'll head over to a different area of the room that'll have one of these pieces hanging on the wall. They'll use their mobile device to scan the QR code, and a question will show up on the screen. Students will then work with a partner to answer the question. And for this piece, I'm not going to allow students to use calculators. I'm going to keep it as handwritten computation because I want that important piece in there. Once a student answers the question correctly, they'll receive a picture clue that will lead them to the next question. So if you see on this one has an arrow, a lightning bolt, and a cloud, that'll be their clue to find the next piece in the scavenger hunt. Once they've answered all the questions, they'll begin the next piece of the assignment. This is an assignment that I do all the time with my students. It's something I usually do around the holidays, but I thought about using calculators for this and how much time it might eliminate. And I thought this would be a great activity in the future for me to use calculators with. So from the articles you shared with us, I learned a lot about how calculator use can it's not going to take away from learning these important skills, but actually give students the opportunity to not necessarily focus on the little things, but the big idea. So for this assignment, every year I give my students an imaginary budget of $500 and they create a shopping list for their family. And my big thing for them is to find tax and also to understand budgeting and writing equations. So on the screen, this is an example of work that one of my students did this past year. So you can see what the outcome of this lesson would look like. So the students will shop for their family members and friends, and then they'll find the tax on the items that are required. And then over on the right-hand side in the last column, students write an equation during each step of the process to show their skills. So in the past, if I scroll down to the end, you can see an example of the computation that my students were doing. So clearly this was a lot of extensive work. There's a lot of multiplication, a lot of subtraction. And I do oftentimes find that when my students are working on this, it takes a lot longer than necessary. And there are students that kind of miss that important piece of finding tax or writing an equation. So this is another student. He has work all over his paper. And although these are great, and I know that my students are learning so much from this, I sometimes really find that if we are missing the big idea. And I really liked the articles you shared this week. And I certainly learned that in the future, I will be incorporating calculators and mobile devices to really get my students engaged and also really hit home those big ideas.